Be live now. Yep, it's live. Okay. Oh. Okay. So I'm just gonna set it up here. If you can check that it stays live.
Hey Emma, how are you? Good. Told you guys you'd see me again.
So you're still on till the end of the. Although this isn't part of the.
I'm just here as well. I'm here as an interested party.
Okay.
So we've got. I'm gonna just move this out of the way. She just hit her.
Oh, that's your camera.
I think it's about time. Good evening, Mayor. Good. How are you? Hopefully, I'd man the camera. There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks. I can't. How are you? Well, I guess it is.
Did we have some Russian speakers?
You don't work for the city.
I don't. I'm a consultant, but I just can't get enough of them, so I'm always here.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Ready for business?
Hopefully after this weekend, I will be.
Traffic at this time.
No problem.
Yeah. How about you?
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
My husband and I are going to spend it with his family, and he's British, so they're all in England. So
You going to England?
yeah, in a week. So it's
How long?
for a little over 2 weeks. It'll be really fun. Southwest. So we're gonna fly into London, stay there for a couple of days, and then head on down. Yeah.
Have fun.
Thank you. I'm excited.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, have fun.
Thanks, Dimas.
Hey, how are you, Sonia?
January or February. And we'll advertise it for you, so you don't have to worry about that. We need that. I need that. I do too. Yeah.
Because the fall's over here. Yeah, should be in here.
I'm good. Twice in one day. How excited.
You know.
The financing stuff that are in the reserve, so we're for city staff and whatever, but there's certainly so. Oh, okay.
I'm gonna wait for him.
Oh, okay. You know Sandy. I was just telling you. Oh. And you're remodeling it as a. You sold it. Oh, good. I can't wait to know. Okay. It's not. Yes, I remember that because I had a friend named females up now. Oh, good. Yeah. Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Are we? No, we're not.
Oh, I just love that. Just a very quick aside, my fitness club is coming Saturday to the play. I'm hoping to get there, but I have shop with a cop in the morning until noon, and then the museum Christmas party, or Santa thing, or Christmas whatever, you know. So I'm hoping to get connected with my. So it's yeah, it is. You should come. Yeah, from 11 to 3. Yeah. So yeah. I think
Good evening. We're going to start in a few moments. If you could please take your seats. Just want to alert folks that if they need Russian or Spanish translation, we have someone Spanish on here on my right and Russian in the back there. Can you wave your hand? Thank you. And daycare down the hallway, if anyone should do that. Well, thank you so much for coming this evening. My name is Alma Flores, and I serve as the Community Development Director for the City of Milwaukee. Thank you so much for being here with us. Tonight, you are joined by several City Council members, Planning Commission members, and members of our Community Planning, Committee on Planning Advisory. What does it stand for? Comprehensive Planning Advisory Committee. Thank you. We have an exciting program this evening with Richard Rothstein of The Color of Law joining us via Skype and our esteemed panelists. But without further ado, I want to introduce one of our esteemed City Council members, Councilor Wilda Parks, who will start us off with some opening remarks. Thank you.
Look at this, it's the biggest microphone I've ever held in my life. I'm not sure what that means, but I just want you to know it's the biggest microphone. And apparently it's doing double duty tonight because it's hooked up to a couple of places. So, oh, wow, what a great group out here. If I keep coming like this, I can see all of you, but then I can't see my notes and I might say the wrong thing. So I will do my best to be able to cover the room. So first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for being here to take the time tonight to participate in a discussion that can help ensure that we are planning for the most equitable, livable, and affordable community that we can. You have the opportunity to be the voice for Milwaukee. This meeting is being streamed live on YouTube, as well as being recorded by Willamette Falls Media. And the minutes will be taken and they'll be posted on the city's website. So you can refer people to any and all of those kinds of ways to find out what went on here this evening. So as many of you probably know, the housing crisis is not an isolated incident in Milwaukee, nor is it just in the Portland metro region. Throughout our nation, there are struggling issues to right the historic wrongs that have created an uneven distribution and supply of housing for people of different races, class, and abilities. Currently, 27% of Milwaukee residents, people you might be sitting next to right now, or people in your families, or neighbors, or perhaps even yourself, are paying more than 50% of their income for rent. So think about that for just a moment. 50% of whatever your income is going strictly for one item of livability. This statistic has labeled Oregon, through the state of Oregon, as a rent-burdened community. Homeowners have also been impacted. 32% of homeowners in Milwaukee, that's close to 1 out of 3. Think about that statistic. 1 out of 3 homeowners in Milwaukee are paying more than 30% of their income on their mortgage. We need to make sure that homeowners have the option to age in place, to build equity, and to feel secure. They deserve that. And right now, there are 1,500, that's 1,500, very low income people waiting for public housing in Milwaukee. That's not countywide. That's 1,500 people in Milwaukee. So housing affordability affects every one of us. Another statistic is that 70% of our city is zoned only for single-family residential units, with an average of 2.32 people per household. So our supply of housing has not kept up with the demand of our demographics. Milwaukee has seen a 58% increase on the median home price between the years 2000 and 2018, and a 16% increase on the average rent for a two-bedroom apartment in that same period. With our current supply, only 12% of vacant residential land, we've got to think about solutions that offer additional opportunities for future growth for our community. So we've come together this evening to provide a platform to collaborate and find solutions. They'll address different housing issues that you or anyone in this room goes through. In particular, how to responsibly address our housing affordability concerns. The Housing Forum is the city's kickoff event to the Comprehensive Plan Update, which has not been comprehensively updated in 30 years. By updating these outdated policies, it'll allow us to shape and develop into the Milwaukee of our future. A Milwaukee in 2040 that's inclusive, welcoming, affordable, livable, and sustainable, as our community vision so strongly laid out for us. The city has already started to address housing solutions and housing issues by declaring a housing emergency in 2016 and adopting a 90-day no-cause eviction ordinance, adopting a construction excise tax for affordable housing, and adopting the city's first housing affordability strategy, which over the next 5 years will be encouraging more housing development, preventing displacement of existing residents, and connecting people to the various resources to address housing needs. Visible change takes time. And visible change requires continuous participation from all of you in the room tonight. You'll influence the new policies that the City Council will adopt. We sincerely hope that we keep hearing from you about what the issues are and what you think the solutions can be, and to enter into discussions like this one. And now, let's get into the focus of the evening. I'd like to introduce our forum moderator, John Topogna. John is president of Eco Northwest. That's a local economic research firm, and he's built consulting practices in education, healthcare, human service, and tax policy. He recently co-authored a report on Portland's homeless crisis for the Oregon Community Foundation. Prior to joining Eco Northwest, John served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Chile and also as an analyst at the U.S. Congressional Budget Office. Please help me welcome John and the panel for the evening. Thank you.
Well, as the city councilor said, there is no bigger public policy issue in front of Milwaukee or the Portland region or anywhere up and down the West Coast and the East Coast than housing. As you saw in the statistics, 27% of Milwaukee renters severely rent burdened. We showed in the Oregon Community Foundation report that is the population that feeds episodic homelessness. If you're spending more than half of your income on rent, you are one crisis away: a job loss, an eviction, domestic violence, etc., from homelessness. And that is a population that is moving in and out of that status. You're also going to find it, we found in past studies, that severe rent burdening is showing up in hunger statistics, not surprisingly. This is your largest household expenditure, and if you're spending that much on housing, there's no way to make your household budget work. So this is a Thursday night of your life that is extremely well spent on an extremely important public policy topic, setting up this city and this region for a critical conversation of what its future is over the coming decades. So I think what we're going to do, I'm assuming Dr. Rothstein is available when he's ready. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce him, that our panelists stay where they are for the time being, because we have a presentation. Richard Rothstein. This is a rare opportunity. Former New York Times columnist. He is also a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He's going to be speaking about a book that he wrote called The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. The book recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods in patterns that violate the Constitution and require remediation. Okay, excellent. There we go. I will say the last time I saw Dr. Rothstein speak, it was at the top of the Chrysler Building in New York City. And he was talking about education at that time and had essentially said, there he is. Well, we'll stop with that story. And Dr. I can.
Okay, great.
You have been fully introduced, and we are eager to hear the presentation about your book. So welcome to Milwaukee, Oregon.
Okay, should I start now?
Yes, fire away.
Okay, let me just say before I start that all I can see is a blank wall. But if you can see me, I guess that's all. Oh, there you are. Okay. All right. Okay, well, let me describe to you the argument that I've been making, or the description of history that I've been making. In the 20th century, this country made a decision to abolish racial segregation. Civil rights lawyers began in the 1930s challenging racial segregation in law schools because they figured that if judges couldn't understand anything else, they could understand that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then civil rights lawyers went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities, and as you know, in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, abolishing segregation in elementary and secondary schools, legal segregation. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision gave impetus to a civil rights movement that used marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience, and people lost their lives. And we eventually eliminated segregation in buses and lunch counters, and water fountains, public accommodations of all kinds. We understood as a nation, not everybody agreed, but we came to a national consensus that racial segregation is wrong. It was harmful to both African Americans and whites, that it was immoral, and that we had to, it was incompatible, we decided, with our status as a constitutional democracy. But yet, we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were African American or all African American, or clearly defined areas that were white or almost all white. How is it that having had a civil rights movement that abolished segregation in all of these other areas of life, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is residentially segregated. That's the puzzle that I tried to solve in my book, The Color of Law. I guess it's in one way, I don't have an answer to that question, but in one way it's not hard to understand. It's harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate water fountains. If we desegregate water fountains, the next day the colored and the white signs come down and people can drink out of any water fountain. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things would look much different. So what we've done is we've adopted, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, all of us have adopted rationalization that excuses ourselves from dealing with this most serious of forms of racial segregation. And that rationalization goes something like this. It says that all of the other forms of racial segregation, the ones we abolished in the 20th century, those we say were created by government, by rule, by law, by regulation, by ordinance. This one, residential segregation, is not like that. This one just happened by accident. It happened because perhaps bigoted homeowners refused to sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe real estate agents and banks, private businesses, discriminated in how they showed homes or granted mortgages. Or maybe we tell ourselves, people just like to live with each other of the same race. They feel more comfortable in the same race neighborhoods, and that's the reason that we self-segregate. Or we say maybe it's because there are income differences. African Americans and whites don't have the same average incomes. Of course, there are exceptions, but on average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and as a result, most of them can't afford to live in higher, more expensive neighborhoods. All of these reasons, we say, is what created residential segregation, and because it wasn't created by government, like all the other forms of segregation, it didn't violate the Constitution. When government passed rules and laws to segregate schools or universities, or lunch counters, or buses, those rules violated the 5th and the 14th Amendments to the Constitution. But residential segregation, because it just happened naturally because of private prejudice or private economic activity, is not a civil rights violation. It didn't violate the Constitution, and as a result, we have an obligation to undo it. Of course, we think it's too bad. I'm sure most of us think it's too bad to have all this residential segregation, but we don't feel an obligation to do anything about it. We feel it just happens to evolve somehow. It needs to evolve naturally to end it. Well, I used to be an education writer. That's how I got into this work. I was not a housing expert. And as a result of my interest in education, in 2007, I read the Supreme Court decision that concerned the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And those two school districts had adopted very, very token desegregation plans. Those school districts gave parents the choice of which school in those districts their child would go to, but if the child's choice was going to make segregation of the schools worse, that choice would be offered in favor of the choice of the child who would help to desegregate the school. So if in Louisville, Kentucky, or Seattle, Washington, you had a school that was white, or all white, or most of all white, and there was one place left, and a black and a white child applied for it, the black child would get some preference, because the child would help to desegregate the school. Well, the Supreme Court prohibited the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington from implementing this program. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, and he said the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That is why schools in those places are segregated. But then he went on to say that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated for all the private reasons that I described before. He gave a name to it. It's a name that we all use. We all adopt this theory. When I say blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, we call it de facto segregation. And the Chief Justice says we have de facto segregation because the neighborhoods were segregated by private choices. There's no permissive remedy. You can't fix it. Well, I remember reading this case in 2007 about a situation that happened several decades before in Louisville, Kentucky, where a white homeowner in a single-family home in Louisville called Shively had an African-American friend, a decorated Navy veteran living in the center city of Louisville. The friend, the African-American friend, had a middle-class job, a decent income, a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single-family home in the suburbs. Nobody would sell him such a home. And so the white homeowner, his friend, bought another home in the suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend to evade the need for real estate agents or banks that might discriminate. And when the African-American family moved in this single-family home in Shively, a mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows, they dynamited and firebombed the home. And when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed the 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, having sold the home to an African American. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much like de facto segregation. The entire criminal justice system, the police, the prosecutors, the courts are going to be employed in enforcing racial boundaries. And I began to wonder whether this was just an isolated instance of government participation in creating segregation, or whether this was part of a more systematic pattern that Chief Justice John Roberts didn't know about. And that's the origin of my book, The Color of Law. I spent close to 10 years working on it, and what I discovered was that not only was the police and courts and prosecutors in Louisville, Kentucky, an example of state sponsorship and enforcement of segregation, but rather there was a systematic policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments at all levels in all parts of the country to enforce racial boundaries, to create segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and to ensure that African Americans and whites couldn't live near one another. If that's the case, and I'm confident that it is the case, my book, The Color of Law, has been out now for a year and a half, and not a single factor is challenged by any historian. So I'm quite confident that the story that you will read in that book is accurate. If it's the case that it was federal, state, and local government that created, enforced, and sustained residential segregation, then it's as much a civil rights violation as the segregation of lunch counters or water fountains or schools or colleges and universities. And if it's a civil rights violation, then we, all of us, whether in Milwaukee or any city in the country, have an obligation as American citizens to undo it, to reverse it, to remedy this violation of civil rights. So let me just spend a few minutes describing some of the main policies that the federal government followed to create segregation. There were many, many others I won't have time to talk about. The first I'll talk about is public housing. Most of us think we know what public housing is, a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country in the New Deal, in the Franklin Roosevelt administration during the Depression. It was a program in which poor people were not permitted to participate. It was not for poor people, it was for working class, middle class families. You know, there was a 25% unemployment rate in the Depression, but public housing was for the 75% who were employed, who had good jobs, stable incomes, could afford to pay rent, but for whom no housing was available because no construction was being done. And everywhere, the government built public housing. It segregated it. It built separate projects for African Americans and whites, frequently segregating places that hadn't previously been segregated, been integrated. There were many integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas in the mid-20th century, unlike today. The reason was that all factories and warehouses had to be located near deep water ports or near a railroad terminal to get their parts and ship their final products. And if you had a factory district, which was employing both African Americans and whites, they all had to be living in roughly the same neighborhood near the factory district so they could walk to work. They didn't have automobiles in those days. So there were many integrated neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in many of these neighborhoods to create separate projects for whites and blacks, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise would never have existed. The great African American poet, novelist, Langston Hughes, some of you may be familiar with him, I hope. He wrote an autobiography, The Big Steve. In that autobiography, he describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said in high school his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was not unique in mid-20th century America. It wasn't the norm, but it wasn't unique because of the reasons I described. That these were integrated neighborhoods near your downtown workplaces. Well, the Public Works Administration went into that community where Langston Hughes lived, an integrated community, demolished housing, created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland that otherwise would never have existed. And it built other projects elsewhere in Cleveland that also were segregated, reinforcing the pattern. This was done everywhere in the country. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to talk about self-satisfied places, smug places, like Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, called the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. It was about half flat, half white. Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and created two separate projects, one for whites and one for African Americans. And with other also segregated projects elsewhere in the Boston area, created a pattern of segregation that previously had not existed. Here on the West Coast, during World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to the centers of defense production to take jobs in war industries during the war. The government always built segregated housing for the workers who came to these places, creating patterns of segregation that hadn't previously existed. There were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II, so that the government, when it segregated housing for the war workers, wasn't building on any pre-existing pattern. But Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and all the cities up and down the West Coast, the federal government created a pattern of segregation by building separate projects for war workers, even though these workers were working in the same plants, same shipyards, same aircraft factories, the same tank factories. Even though they were working in the same plants, the government segregated their housing, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise hadn't existed. After World War II, there was a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. It was everywhere. Giant towers were built. You may have heard of some of them, like Robert Taylor Homes or Cabrini Green in Chicago, or Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, which is perhaps the most well-known of these. A vast expansion of public housing to take care of the needs of returning war veterans who faced an enormous housing shortage when they returned from Europe and from the Far East after World War II. There was no housing available for them. No housing was built in the Depression except for these few public projects that I described. But during the war, it was actually illegal to use construction materials to do anything for civilian purposes unless it was to house war workers. And then, of course, after the war, these war veterans overwhelmed the whole country with their housing needs. So giant expansion still for working class families, people who pay the full cost of housing and their rent, not for poor people. But very soon afterwards, very soon after the vast expansion of public housing, a development occurred that was quite surprising to most people, and it occurred everywhere in the country. And that is that the African American designated public projects had long waiting lists, long waiting lists. The white designated projects started to develop large numbers of vacancies. Soon the situation became so untenable that the government had to permit all the projects to be occupied by African Americans. You couldn't have the same community where some projects had long waiting lists and others were virtually empty. So the projects became predominantly African American. At about the same time, industry left the cities. It moved to rural areas and to far out suburbs where we could get lots of land for spread out assembly lines. It no longer needed to be located near a deep water port or near a railroad terminal because the highways were being built and industry could get its parts and ship its final products by truck. So the people in public housing who are now wealthy African American became poorer and poorer because they no longer had access to good jobs. The government had to start subsidizing housing, subsidizing the rents. The families in public housing could no longer pay the full cost of housing in their rent. Once that happened, the government stopped investing in the projects and stopped maintaining them. They started to deteriorate, and we got the urban slums that we know public housing to be today. But that's not how it started. It's not how it has to be. Well, why did the vacancies occur in the white projects? That was because of another federal program that was equally powerful in creating segregation. And that was a program by the Federal Housing Administration, a racially explicit program that was designed to segregate the entire white population into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This was a racially explicit program of the Federal Housing Administration. You're again familiar with these projects. They're all over the country. This is how the country came to be suburbanized in the 1940s and 50s. The most famous of these is Levittown, east of New York City. I assume you've heard of that one. Maybe some of you may remember hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing about little boxes on the hillside. They were ticky-tacky and they all looked the same. That was about a development just about as large as Levittown. It was south of San Francisco. And between San Francisco and Levittown and New York, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these places, the government built subdivisions surrounding the cities. They couldn't have done it. The developers of these subdivisions could not have done it without federal participation. Levittown, 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt the money, build a development of that size. She had no buyers. The only way Levitt could build that development for any of these builders all across the country, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these developments. The only way they could build them was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, pledging never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and all of these other builders to put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. There was nothing de facto about this. This was a racially explicit program. It wasn't the actions of rogue bureaucrats working in the Federal Housing Administration. The federal government had a manual which specified that no bank guarantees would be issued to a developer who was going to sell homes to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that no guarantees could be granted to a developer who was going to build a development for all white families if it was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, it ran the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion that we have de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There's no basis in historical reality whatsoever. These two programs, the action of the Federal Housing Administration to suburbanize the white population into single-family homes in a white use surrounding cities, and the program of the various public housing authorities, both federal and local, to create segregated patterns in cities that otherwise never knew it, or if it had, it reinforced and enhanced it. These two programs created the racial patterns that we know today. They still determine those patterns, and let me conclude by explaining why they do. The suburban homes that were created in the 1940s and 50s, early 50s, that suburbanized this country, were very inexpensive. Returning war veterans, working class families, white families. They sold at the time to these returning war veterans for $8,000, $9,000 a piece. Today's inflation-adjusted money, that's about $100,000. These are $100,000 homes. Any working class family, any returning war veteran, white or black, could afford such a home. Only whites were permitted to buy them. African Americans were prohibited. The white families could move out of public housing and with a VA mortgage in one of these suburbs, pay less in their monthly housing costs than they had been paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the incentive was to take advantage of this racial program that the government was operating. Today, those 100,000 homes, $100,000 homes, sell for, I don't know what they are in the area of Oregon where you are, but most places are $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next few generations hundreds of thousands of dollars in wealth from the equity they had in appreciating homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of medical or unemployment emergencies. And they used it to finance their own retirements. And they used it to bequeath funds to their own children and grandchildren so they could have down payments for homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating by explicit racial policy in this wealth-generating program, gained none of these advantages. Today, African American incomes, on average, nationwide, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. You would think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio too. Any family can save equally easily from the same income. But the reality is that while there's a 60% income ratio, the wealth ratio is 10%. African Americans have 10% the wealth, average household wealth, that white families do. That enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that's never been remedied, that we've never even tried to remedy, and that we, all of us, are obligated to remedy as citizens of a constitutional democracy. The segregation the government created, not de facto, with jury segregation, government-sponsored segregation the government created, not only resulted in this wealth gap that determines much of the social inequality we have in this country today, it determines the achievement gap in schools that I was so concerned about when I started this research. African American children, on average, have much lower academic achievement, white children, mostly because we're concentrating so many African American children with severe social and economic disadvantages in single classrooms, single schools, where their social and economic problems overwhelm the ability of schools to deal with them. The segregation determines the health disparities in this country, which are unconscionable. African Americans have much lower life expectancies than whites, higher rates of heart disease, in large part because so many of them live in less healthy neighborhoods, more polluted air, more stress in those neighborhoods. The segregation determines the violence that we see between police and young men, which couldn't exist in places like Ferguson, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Baltimore, Maryland, and elsewhere, couldn't exist if we weren't concentrating most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to jobs or opportunity. And the segregation that government created is in part responsible for the dangerous political polarization that exists in this country today. It is inconceivable that we can develop a common national identity, which is essential to having a functioning democracy, if African Americans and whites are living so far from each other, so systematically separate from each other, that they have no ability to understand each other's problems, to identify with each other's life experiences, to develop a common national identity, without which our democracy is going to wither. So the consequences of government policy, of the civil rights violations that government created in order to create segregation, are enormous. They're a little bit abstract, they're a little bit distant, but they're enormous. And although we have an enormous housing crisis today, if we continue to solve the housing crisis by putting what affordable housing we create in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, what we'll be doing is solving an immediate problem, which is real, the housing crisis, while further exacerbating many, many dangerous long-term problems in education, in health, in criminal justice, and in our democratic system. The solutions to racial segregation are not hard to understand and hard to figure out. Policymakers can figure this out very easily. There are many, many programs that we've talked about, reduce and even drastically reduce residential segregation. We don't have the political will at this point to do it, in part, but only in part, because we have a myth that rationalizes away the problem, claiming that it's de facto, unintentional, not our responsibility. In order to desegregate and to enact the policies, which, as I say, are easy to develop, we need to understand that it's an unconstitutional system, and the court's understanding is not alone enough. Just as in the 1960s, the civil rights movement that's going to address this is going to require not only litigation and legislation, but marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. I can't predict what it will do. But I do hope that all of you will be part of that civil rights movement, because we have a serious obligation as American citizens to redress residential segregation. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Rothstein. We're going to invite a panel up here in just a moment, but I was just going to say that was such a thorough rebuttal to the Chief Justice. I'm wondering if he's read your book and if he's responded to you.
Well, people ask me that frequently, and what I tell them is it doesn't matter if he reads the book, because until you demand that policies change, the Supreme Court is not going to respond.
Well, thank you. And thank you for spending the time. I don't know where you are. Are you on the East Coast, the West Coast?
No, I'm on the West Coast today.
Okay, all right. So I don't have to worry about it being 10 o'clock, wherever you are.
No.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well now we're going to invite a panel up, and we are very blessed by 3 local experts. We'll start with Marisa Zapata. She's the director of the new Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative at Portland State University, and an associate professor of land use planning at Portland State. As an educator, scholar, and planner, Dr. Zapata is committed to achieving spatially based social justice by preparing planners to act in the face of uncertain and inequitable futures we face. She believes how we use land reflects our social and cultural values. Dr. Zapata is the co-editor of Engaging the Future, Forecast Scenarios, Plans, and Projects, published in 2007 and recently translated into Chinese. So welcome, Dr. Zapata. Her colleague,
Dr. Matthew Gebhardt at Portland State and is an assistant professor of urban studies and planning and real estate development. Dr. Gebhardt's research concerns the translation of visions, plans, and policies into action, and the structures and institutions that facilitate or constrain this process and produce intended or unintended outcomes. This research includes national programs such as the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative and Rental Assistance Demonstration, local issues including accessory dwelling units, ADUs, inclusionary housing, and informal activities such as food carts and temporary retail. So welcome, Dr. Gebhardt. And a neighbor of mine, Alan Lazo, is the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, a statewide civil rights organization founded in 1990, whose mission is to end housing discrimination and ensure equal opportunity to housing. Alan's past civic engagement and social justice work includes having served on a variety of commissions and committees in Portland and Gresham, including the City of Gresham Planning Commission and the City of Portland's Human Rights Commission. He is a longtime resident of Portland, mostly of outer East Portland, and currently lives down the street from me in the Roseway neighborhood. Welcome, Alan. So I can't imagine having found three local individuals who are more capable of addressing and reacting to what we just heard from Dr. Rothstein. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. Dr. Rothstein, you described a process that was 100 years in the making, and many different state and local decisions to get to where we are. You started to hint at the end of your presentation of how we start to undo or unwind these many decisions that we have made in the past. So how do we get started, and what are some of the challenges that we face out of the gate in addition to the political will that you described? So I'll start with Dr. Rothstein and then turn it over to the panel.
Well, first of all, let me, a personal note, I'm not doctor.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Mr.
I just figured if I cut that off now, it wouldn't be. Well, as I said, I don't want to minimize just skip over quickly the political challenges. What's absolutely essential is that we develop a new political consensus around this history and around our obligations. But as I said, once we have that, the policies are easy to understand. I can go through a few of them. You're all familiar, Alan and I actually have talked about this a great deal. You're all familiar with the low-income housing tax credit program. The federal government, its regulations for the low-income housing tax credit program place a priority on placing low-income housing in already low-income neighborhoods. That's exactly the wrong approach. It's the opposite of what we need. What we need to do is place at least some of our low-income housing, much more than we're doing now, in high-opportunity neighborhoods that would help to desegregate metropolitan areas. Local states and localities also set regulations, qualified allocation plans for the distribution of these tax credits, and those allocation plans also to place a priority on developers who are willing to create not concentrated low-income housing, but mixed-income housing that include low-income units in high-opportunity areas, not only in low-income segregated neighborhoods. The same thing is true of the Section 8 voucher program, the other low-income program that we have and you all know how that works, the rental subsidies and the government issues. The way that program is structured, most of those Section 8 vouchers are usable only in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. We could very easily change the regulations in that program so that we place the priority on the use of those vouchers in higher opportunity communities. That would be easy. Both of those programs could easily be reformed if we wanted to do it. The problem is not the technical difficulty, the problem is the will. At the high end, We have the biggest federal housing program that we have, by far bigger than the low-income housing tax credit program or the Section 8 program, is a subsidy that we continue to give to single-family homeowners in mostly in white and predominantly white neighborhoods. It's much more expensive than anything else we do. It's a bigger drain on the federal budget, and that's the mortgage interest deduction, which is a subsidy a continued subsidy to single-family homeowners that is incomparable in size to the helping of the low-income families. We could leverage that mortgage interest deduction to create desegregation. We could, for example, we could withhold the mortgage interest deduction from homeowners and communities that refuse to take steps to desegregate, that maintain, for example, zoning rules that prohibited the construction within the community of anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes. We wouldn't have to make it a punitive program. We could take those mortgage interest deductions that weren't granted to the homeowners, put them in escrow, and return them to the homeowners. Their community took steps to desegregate by changing their zoning rules, by accepting apartments, scattered apartments, not high-rises, but scattered apartments, townhouses, even single-family homes on small lot sizes. That would be a program to take a step towards desegregation. I could go on and on. Like I say, the policies to address this are easy to figure out. Policymakers talk about them all the time. We're not doing them, not because we don't know how, we're not doing them because we don't have the political will. And that's our major challenge.
All right, I'm going to pause here before the panel takes over. Just a process reminder, staff are collecting comments and questions, and I think we'll turn over at 7:30, and I'll be reading questions to the panel from the audience. So, panelists from Portland, pick that up where Mr. Rothstein left off.
Actually, Richard is fine.
Richard, where Richard left off.
Can you hear me okay, or do I need to move this mic a little closer?
He needs to use that mic. He needs to use that mic. Yes. Yes.
Hi, Richard. It's probably a little unfair for them to have invited both of us to this because we're just going to double team folks on these issues. I think a couple of things. One, we're here talking about housing tonight, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what housing means to me in the work that I do. A lot about housing being the roof over our head and getting people inside and housed. The way I really look at it, what Richard has touched on, is that housing for us really is about those opportunities out the front door, where we are giving folks opportunity. And I think that's, as Richard's touched on here, is really part of the conversation that we're missing here, this idea of looking at where opportunity exists and where we can locate housing and not just talking about housing. I think there's a lot of examples in the material that we use to prepare for this. I looked at your housing needs analysis, housing affordability strategy, and I think we need to pay attention to the things that Richard is talking about, that when we talk about where we're going to bring in housing, especially affordable housing, I think we need to be talking about where we're putting that in our communities. I think if there's a value that we share as a community, it's around creating a life of opportunity for our families, for ourselves. And the history that Richard has laid out here makes it clear that we've denied those opportunities to many members of our community. And the nature of really creating equity in our communities is that we do have a responsibility to remedy these past historical wrongs in a fashion that produces equitable outcomes for these harmed communities that Richard has talked about. And so I think it's a little, I think there are a couple of false premises in some of the questions that were asked tonight. I don't think we need to ask the question whether or not we have a responsibility to right these wrongs. I think Richard's laid that out. Not only do we have a moral responsibility, we quite frankly have a legal and constitutional obligation to correct these injustices that have come about in the history of housing discrimination. So we know that we have this responsibility to truly embrace those values of creating these communities that are open, inclusive, and provide opportunity for all, ensure that we have, that we're putting in place these policies, processes, and practices, whether that's through how we write our local zoning codes, how we look at our comp plans, or how we engage members of our public. And I think that's important too. I know that you folks are all here tonight, but I think there are a lot of community organizations that are bringing forward ideas that we ought to be thinking about, listening to, and that's happening in other communities, and we talk more specifically about those as we move forward. As far as challenges, I think, Richard, I agree with you that one of the big pieces is that sense that we might get a complacency of not accepting that responsibility if we believe that this situation was created by this de facto segregation rather than intentionally created by de jure segregation. If we accept that premise, then we ought to be able to accept the premise also that we can be intentional about crafting those remedies as we move forward, and remedies that are quite intentional in just remedying the situation that he's talked so specifically about. So that'll, I'll leave it for that for now.
Hey y'all. So I think I'm from Texas, sorry, I can't remove that from my soul. I think one of the first things that people need to do in their communities to elevate this work is what y'all are doing tonight, right? It's showing up, it's having these conversations, it's building this political consensus and will, and deciding as a community that you want to redress segregation, inequity, and provide affordable housing for all community members. I want to really underscore what Richard, not Mr. Rothstein, what Richard was talking about in the sense that none of this is accidental. How we are, how we function is deliberate. And I often hear people say when we look at the state of the country today, oh, the system's broken, the system's broken. The system isn't broken. It is functioning exactly how it was designed to function for the people for whom it was designed for. And who was it designed for? Rich, white, land-owning, cisgender, heterosexual men. System's going great for them. It's everyone else that the system is not quite doing the best thing for. And that was by choice, right? That's not accidental. It has been a very deliberate attempt. And I think that that's something I go back to. I tell my students a lot. We are undoing the foundation of our country. How we live, how our land is allocated, who our neighbors are allowed to be, was structured in our Constitution from the start. And so we can also then turn and rely on that Constitution to say, but wait, you actually said some other things that maybe you didn't mean for me, but I'm gonna make you do that now and help me. When I think about Portland, I don't know how many of y'all noticed in the slides what the percentage of people who aren't white in the city of Milwaukee is. Audience participation time. 16%, very good, excellent. But you work for the city, you're cheating. No gold star for you. Right, so that is not accidental. So when you're like, why are we talking about race so much? We're a majority white city. Why are you a majority white city? Why are you a majority white region? It's a long history of deliberate exclusion to make a white racial utopia. Again, not accidental. And that makes people really uncomfortable, but the more we talk about it and say it, it creates the space to then draw from the huge list of policies that are out there to make some really awesome change happen. And I think that's the point that we're at now, right? The list is there. The technical need, we do know how to do this. And if you're looking for inspiration, go Google the Cleveland Policy Plan from the early 1970s. A wonderful reminder of how people used to write about policy. It actually starts off with deep references to all religious texts you can imagine. So there's a lot about Jesus and Muhammad, and everyone you can imagine is in there, Plato. But then it delves into what does it take to do good equity planning. And it lays out the technical needs that we have and the data needs that we have. It's the same stuff. We know how to do this. Y'all know how to do this. It's just a question of us deciding to do it.
So I would echo what all my fellow panelists have said about the importance of understanding the history behind this. It's absolutely important to learn about that, to educate yourself, to engage around it, to, as my colleague Dr. Zapata just mentioned, actually engage, talking about it. Not being afraid to actually discuss it openly and continuously to continue to work to get better. I also wanted to emphasize that these aren't things that have simply been in the past. Richard mentioned the wealth gap that exists, that has grown and developed based off of these policies that have meant that certain people, African Americans in particular, were not able to build wealth through home ownership in particular. And so this is a continuing problem. Even if we remove the barriers that exist for moving forward, we still have this long-standing wealth gap that creates the challenges in terms of accessing neighborhoods of high opportunity. And so there are things that we need to do to proactively address those historical injustices, not just remove the barriers to moving forward. I think I would emphasize a couple of the limitations that we do have, though, and I hate to be the one kind of ending this, the answers to this question on a kind of down note, but a big part of it is political will, and again, educating ourselves and engaging around this can help to build that political will. But when we do that, there are tools that are available, but those tools do have limitations to them. Some of them built in to the way that the programs are structured. So the mention of the low-income housing tax credit program. There are federal preferences that give you bonuses if you do locate in areas of high poverty, low-income neighborhoods. That is something that is a challenge because it makes it easier to fund projects in those areas. So it does guide us toward that. Also, land is not counted in that. So even if you are able to get tax credits to fund the construction of a project, you still have to have somewhere to put it. And you can't actually get the funding for that land. So having land available to go into these projects would be incredibly important as well. There's overall limited public resources. We just had a conversation about this last night at one of other meetings about the inability to increase the level of public resources around things like the Section 8 vouchers. So we are underfunding them. Based off of the anticipated need, we still don't get the amount that's necessary, that we're supposed to be getting. Right now, Multnomah County is about 98% of what we're supposed to be getting, which is pretty good. But considering that the need goes up 10% or the rents go up 10% every year, and our amount that we get goes down every year, this is a real problem in making these sorts of programs work. Also, with regard to real estate, we have the problem that it's fixed in place. It's not like we can pick up houses and move them around easily. We are often dependent on the private sector for funding and building these. There's, again, limited public resources. There's a high cost in building new real estate. They have long lifespans, long lead times for actually getting them developed. So it's quite challenging. We also are limited in our ability to affirmatively use things like race in these programs for the same reasons that we shouldn't have been discriminated in the past, right? Because of the constitutional obligations to not do that, it makes it very challenging to use that in an affirmative fashion moving forward as well. So sorry to end with a series of limitations.
Yeah, I'm going to try to bring this back to the hopeful side here. So Richard, I'll go ahead and start with you. As you've been around the country and you've been presenting your information, et cetera, I imagine have met many communities like Milwaukee. Where do you find examples of communities that are leaning into this challenge and are starting to show some progress?
Well, there are many places. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. there are many, many communities that are trying to make progress in this area. Of course, some of the progress is going to depend on federal legislation. Some is going to depend on state legislation. But there are things that communities can do. There are many places in this country, for example, I could start naming places, but you can find as easily as I can. There are many places that have implemented mobility programs for the Section 8 voucher program, sometimes with private funds, sometimes with state support, sometimes as a result of litigation settlements that give enhanced vouchers to families who move to high opportunity communities. Many communities in this country have prohibited discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. I don't know if yours is one, but in most of the country, most places, landlords are permitted to refuse to accept. They don't have to say that we're not going to rent to you because you're black. They can say we're not going to rent to you because we don't like where your rent comes from. And many communities, well, that's not true. Some communities have prohibited that kind of discrimination. It's not an all or nothing situation with the low-income housing tax credit. It's not that no projects are now being placed in high opportunity communities. Some are, and some communities are doing a better job than others of doing that. It's certainly true that there are incentives built into the program not to do that. But we can change the incentives, and local communities, as well as their states, have some ability to change those incentives. They can't eliminate the federal incentive not to do it, but they can create their own incentives that override the federal incentives, so that more low-income housing tax credit projects are placed in high opportunity communities. There are many communities in this country that have begun to consider or adopt inclusionary zoning rules, which require any developer to set aside a share of units, even in high opportunity communities, for low-income families. The best one is probably Montgomery County outside Washington, D.C., a very affluent community, which requires that 15% of all units in any new development, this is a very affluent community, 15% be set aside for low-income families, and of that 15%, the Montgomery County Public Housing Authority purchases 1/3, or 5% total, for its public housing residents. So we have public housing residents now dispersed throughout Montgomery County. It's a terrific program, and it's been studied, like most of these programs, and the outcomes of children from families who are in these dispersed public housing units within private developments are far superior to those of children who are similar in every other respect, as not housed in integrated areas. So those are a few examples of places that things that are being done. There are some places that are trying to limit the ability of communities to maintain single-family zoning throughout the community, and that prohibits the construction of moderate income housing. That would be another one. I can certainly, well, the best place, let me say this, the best place, rather than me rattle off a list of different places, the best place to find examples of communities are making progress in this area is a website, Community and Race Research Action Council. It's PRRAC.org. And it has several pages that describe different communities that are making progress in this area. So it's not impossible.
Any examples from the panel of places you feel like are supporting?
So I'll quickly plug another website that's got an amazing set of resources. PolicyLink has a great set of case studies and resources on places that are doing great stuff. There's a movement around trying to do more locally created long-term rent-assisted funds, particularly in response to the fact that HUD is continuing to cut that as a source of funding, kind of recognizing that we're kind of on our own, right? The federal government is not going to help us as much as we need, as much as we might think we deserve or want. And so actually thinking about what would a locally administered long-term rent assistance fund look like. Portland, they're doing a pilot study. In Los Angeles, they've done a much larger attempt at that. My understanding, I need to verify this, but my understanding is the entire state of Connecticut has a long-term long-term rent assistance program. And so thinking about what that would actually look like and how you would get funding for that and administer it for your own community, I think has a lot of really great traction.
Yeah, I had that written down as well, which I think is an important step, sort of to subsidize on the demand side. One of the challenges is that it is a pilot program, so the long-term funding, which is again a political will question and a source of funding, but I think it's a really important potential step. I think there's also strategies around things like land banking to provide that land, to have it available for affordable housing development. The city of Eugene has an interesting program around that. It's one, though, that is a very long-term strategy to try to acquire land and have it available. Opening up neighborhoods, particularly single-family neighborhoods, to other housing types, so things like accessory dwelling units, or cottage clusters or things of that nature, perhaps even higher density type of developments. I would note that one of the points that Richard brought up was also about the ability to use things like Section 8 vouchers in different areas. And just up the road, we do have an organization that has already done that, used some of the flexibility available by being a moving to work agency to actually differentiate payment standards in different areas. So it is easier to actually access higher opportunity neighborhoods as well. So there are local examples of some of these that we've been talking about.
The microphone again, I'll put another one I just thought of. Minneapolis has just passed the ability to do infill development with triplexes in their single-family home residential areas, which, as you saw on the slides, is also an issue for here. So just creating the space to have more development. And I think that requires like a lot of really great community conversations. When I lived and worked in the Midwest and the East Coast, when you said increased density, everyone imagined Gotham, and they screamed and they cried because it was going to be Gotham, and where was Batman going to be? My understanding here is that it's Hong Kong. Everyone gets really scared that if you do even moderate increases of density, it's going to be Hong Kong. I also really want to say very quickly, because we keep talking about moving people to higher opportunity neighborhoods, and as a person of color, that's very unsettling for me. I understand why we talk about that and why in a lot of cases that might be good, but when we focus on that as our policy outcome, we are explicitly saying we can't actually fix the communities that we've abandoned, and your best hope is to leave your community. And I find that like very, very unsettling. And I always know there's like a tension there, because if I'm looking at a kid and I'm like, if I get you a voucher into this awesome school with this awesome social network, your individual life circumstances may turn out quite differently. But I'm also telling your family, your friends, your cousins that we can't help you. We can't. And so I just want to make sure that people keep that in mind when we're thinking about, there's a lot of reasons to have opportunity to move to high opportunity neighborhoods, but we also have to think about what we owe the communities that we have left in poverty.
That's a perfect lead-in for what I'm going to talk about. Just as far as community organizations, I think there's a great example right here in Portland, up in the Cully neighborhood, which is not far from where John and I live in Northeast Portland, where you have local organizations that are working to bring and make investments in their local community to help keep that community there. I live next to that neighborhood, and I pass through it quite frequently, and I have to tell you, and I just saw an article out in the paper, I'm not sure that we're winning. And I think it's very difficult. You know, a place like Cully can be a lab where we test these things like community land banking and all these things, but it takes such a long time for community development to happen. We don't know what will work. And every situation is different. So these are complex problems that take multiple solutions and long periods of time to understand. So that's one to watch, and you can see the things that have happened there, the kinds of investments that have been made particularly around environmental justice and creating jobs in that community. And frankly, I don't know that they're going to work there. I mean, because in a lot of places they're fighting the economic pressures there. The other thing I will say before I pass back, I know we're going to go to questions, is that we jump to operationalizing what are our solutions, how do we get to, and I think that when we're setting policies, when we're looking at plans, we ought to look at, to make sure that we set some strategic, high-level pieces that lead us in the right direction. I think an example is at the statewide housing plan right now, they went out and set strategic goals first, and the first one of those is leading with racial equity. And I didn't see that in a lot of the materials for your city. I think it's a discussion that should be had here. It's also contained in the Portland plan and infiltrating into their comp plan. They also brought in community, a set of 11 anti-displacement measures that were brought forward by the community, I think as a response to leading with that racial equity. So I think it's a real consideration as you all are embarking on this years-long journey to update your comp plan and think about what that might mean for your community.
Okay, I'm going to transition a little bit here. We've got we have more questions than we have time, but all of the questions will go to the city, and there will be responses to those. So if they're not answered here, keep your eyes out for the answers later. You saw in the beginning of this a reference to 27% of renters in Milwaukee being severely cost burdened. More than 50% of their income being spent on housing. That is literally a crisis. They're on the verge of homelessness if they're not already homeless, etc. What are policy levers? These are, we talk about some of these solutions as being longer term, mid-range, comprehensive plan kinds of questions, but these are immediate crises that need addressing right now, and I'm going to throw in a loaded one on top of it because it comes from the questions. How does rent control work into this conversation and other policy levers? We'll start with
Excuse me, let me just say goodbye.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
going to sign off now.
Okay.
And I want to thank you all for your attention, and I appreciate being with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we just wanted to skip out on the rent control question, but we'll leave it to our local experts on that one. Take it away, anything with regard to severely costly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big challenges is that a lot of the strategies are long-term strategies in terms of reducing the overall cost of housing. I mean, I think that some of the things like the local supported sort of voucher program opportunities to deal sort of immediately with some of these questions. I think some of them also have to do with preservation of existing affordable housing structures to make sure that we're not in a position of losing them to sort of market pressures so that we're not reducing the supply of affordable housing and creating further burdens. So I think those are two things that we could look into. Maybe come back to me on the rent control question.
So yeah, I just want to underscore what Matthew just said. About 4 years ago, I knew very little about homelessness. I was an urban planner, loved comp plans, that was my bag. Now I'm like all homelessness all the time. And the number one thing that y'all can do to stop homelessness is get as much cash as you can possibly get together to deploy to those people who are living at that kind of rent burden level. They are on the verge of losing their home. If they aren't losing their home, they're being displaced. Oftentimes it's families having to move multiple times across school districts. The kids are massively disrupted in that process. That is the number one thing that you can do, as well as identifying the buildings that are most likely to be developed and where you're going to lose that naturally occurring affordable housing. So those are my two things. It's rent stabilization, not rent control.
It depends on which side you're on. So Dr. Spot, that's the perfect lead-in because I think, as Richard pointed out, I think we know what the solutions are. And this one, it's just a math formula, right? How we got here was a disinvestment by the federal government in affordable housing. And what we know is that the market will not, the private market will not develop at the end where we have the greatest need. Okay? So if you look at your Milwaukee housing needs analysis and you look at the comparison of household income to supply at affordable income levels, you'll see that there is a, you actually don't have it. Sorry. Don't go online and see if you get it. That where we are have a shortage of units is at the lower end of the market, those who are least able to afford housing. So the private market is not going to develop that. Investments, like treating housing like infrastructure and making investments by our jurisdictions, by our government. Now, the upside is that that's been supported in communities like Portland. We passed a affordable housing bond measure in Portland a year ago. I'm on the bond oversight committee in Portland. And in the metro region, we just also passed an affordable housing bond measure. So there is political will in our communities to solve this problem. And so those resources are coming forward. Again, from my perspective, I think we need to be cognizant of how we deploy those resources, where they're going to come into your communities, how we solve the issues around opportunity. You know, one of the things we did in both of those instances was bring together stakeholders to talk about which communities should be served, where we think there are areas of opportunity in communities, and those are conversations we need to have as you deploy those resources. But you know, at some point, it is just about resources. The other thing you should note in the housing needs analysis, there's actually a surplus at the upper end of the market and the middle part of the market. So the formula is pretty easy to figure out. We just need the will to do it and move it forward.
All right, back to political will, picking up a question from the audience. How significant a barrier is resistance from neighborhood members themselves, i.e. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, when trying to change policies and implement projects to integrate low-income housing predominantly in higher income areas? I'll add a friendly amendment to this question. Are there some instances where local actors and local politicians acting rational, in their own rational self-interest and getting reelected, that maybe the regulatory power, some would argue, is in the wrong place, that some regulatory power should be elevated to the state, so it's not simply local actors interacting with local actors. NIMBYism has been around for an awful long time. It's been playing into some of this history and maybe a lot of this history. How do we conquer it?
So I do think that it is potentially a challenge in certain neighborhoods, in certain locations, because we have these long-standing narratives about, as Richard talked about, who are the people who are living in affordable housing units, and oftentimes they are, we construct very scary narratives about who they are and about the quality of the buildings and things like that. And I think one of the things that we do need to do, and we've talked a lot about kind of engaging and educating and making it clear that that's not the people who, again, that's not, those narratives aren't accurate. I think it's also important to note that oftentimes affordable housing development is built at a higher end than private housing development. In part because of the desire to build to a standard where you don't have to replace things quite as often, because you don't have the kind of ongoing operating subsidies that you might get from market rate housing. So oftentimes they are very high quality buildings. And so I think one of the key pieces here is engaging around this and educating to combat the potential.
I will go next because it actually fits perfectly. So at Fair Housing Council of Oregon, that local opposition is a concern to us to the extent that we actually have guides that we produce that are called Common Ground for Inclusive Communities. There's actually one here that's a guide for elected officials. There's one that's a guide for neighbors. I didn't bring enough of these. Actually, I only brought one copy, which is not enough. But especially for the jurisdictional folks, I think we want to get this in your hands as a resource for how to talk about this issue, because it is quite widespread. We also, I think, since they took the gloves off earlier, in your housing needs analysis, there's actually a chart that shows subsidized housing units in Clackamas County communities. So Clackamas County has 3,264 subsidized units. In Milwaukee, there are 428. In zip code 97267, which is south of Milwaukee, there are 412. In Happy Valley, there are 417. In Westland, there are 0. In Lake Oswego, there are 75. And in Oregon City, there are 517. 75. So I would say take a look at that chart, and I think it gives us a sense for what not being able to create opportunities for affordable housing look like in different communities. I was on the City Progression Planning Commission, as my bio mentioned, about 15 years ago now, and we had conversations about regional fair share. And if you know the history of East Portland, right, today's history of East Portland, that has seen the displacement of the African American community into that area, it's because there was a surplus of affordable housing that had landed in the East Portland, Rockwood area. And as the Planning Commission, this was prior to that displacement occurring, we recognized that we had taken a disproportionate share of affordable housing into that community. And I think when you look at how we are talking about that and what we're doing about it as a region, I think that some of that responsibility goes to Metro, our regional planning government.
Yes, I think that this is an interesting connection between region and neighborhood, and I think it's really important. One of the things that I think long-term, the most important strategy that the city of Milwaukee can undertake is figuring out the best way to collaborate with the other entities in the region. So Metro, the county, the other towns, how does everybody fit together, the housing authorities, because this is about fair share, right? And this shows up in the neighborhoods a lot. I live in St. John's in Portland, and that's a scrappy neighborhood. The things that it has taken on, it's more than fair share on absolutely everything. And in some cases that's true, and in some cases that's not. And so I think a lot of communities feel like unless they're the Lake Oswego or the Eastmoreland neighborhoods, they all think that they've been a quote dumping ground. And so putting some actual analytics behind that, I think does help NIMBY conversations to say, look, actually this neighborhood over here has a much higher share of subsidized housing, or has a much lower share of subsidized housing. And I think that that helps take the conversation from perception to fact. And the facts do matter still, they really do. And so that does help show that, hey, wait, actually it's our turn to take this and deal with it. And there's also, of course, all sorts of problematic language of we have to take this that you hear, but again, at least it's helping shift that conversation. In Portland, we have been experimenting with the tiny home villages for people experiencing homelessness, and as much as I disagree with how those conversations have been structured, allowing neighbors to believe that they think they have a right to vote on whether they get a village, which is a violation of fair housing law to say that you think you can vote on who lives next to you. I think it does show that NIMBYs can become YIMBYs. The neighborhood of Kenton, the initial neighborhood vote was overwhelmingly against the village locating there. And at the last vote, after having been neighbors to the women's village in Kenton for the last year, it went the complete opposite direction. And so there are opportunities to engage in conversation and constructive learning and dialogue. Don't do that voting thing though, y'all. It's real bad.
And I would just reemphasize that 27% of Milwaukee's households are severely rent burdened. So the people who are going to be living in that affordable housing are probably people that you know. They're probably people who are in this room. They're probably your neighbors right now. So, I mean, I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
Okay, I'm going to put a couple of questions together. Please address the phenomenon of gentrification and how to avoid its unintended consequences. As we develop amenities, parks, retail, et cetera, in different parts of Milwaukee, how do we protect the residents of those very areas from displacement due to inevitable rent and housing cost increases as a result of that development?
There aren't unintended consequences of gentrification. They are very intended. They are very intended to make people who are from low-income backgrounds or less desirable community members move. And don't ever underestimate that that is a very deliberate strategy. One of the things, the reason why we care about regional fair share conversations is that a lot of times when cities go in and say, we're gonna spruce up this neighborhood or put in this fancy light rail stop, oops, all the other people moved to another city that used to live there. Now they're not our problem. That is often quite by design. And so we want to keep track of how people are moving because of these investments. So I don't think for a second that there's unintended consequences from gentrification. I think they're part of the design. The displacement of people who have lived in these neighborhoods historically having to move is a deliberate and conscious part of that process. Now you can decide to do it differently, and the 13 anti-displacement PDX amendments that went into the comp plan in Portland were specifically designed to address that. So thinking about how do we keep people in place, there's also an effort to give people right to return. So allowing people to have priority to move back into North Portland who have been displaced by community investment. And so there's a lot of different things you can do. I think you've had some of those conversations with the light rail stop that came into Milwaukee, is thinking about how do you identify who's here? The moment that you say you might have a light rail stop come in, property values immediately start to go up. So who gets priority? How do you support them? Are you building mixed income housing and requiring that around your light rail stop, right? So those are some of the more common ways of doing that. But those 13 strategies for anti-displacement PDX were pretty well thought through in the list of what they put together. But don't ever accept an urban planner who tells you it is an accidental thing that happens with displacement. No, some of my students still say that, and I'm like, what is wrong with you? We know what happens. Don't say it's accidental. Plan for it. You can address it through different strategies and policy options.
Yes, I think Richard was still connecting. One of the things that he and I talked about when he was here in Portland is, and I think we think of gentrification now as that bad word because it is the displacement very often of communities of color. But what we have to recognize is that those communities of color that are in place don't necessarily, they do want to have their community built up. They do want those same amenities that we are bringing into those communities. They just want to be able to stay there and enjoy it, right? So that's kind of what's happening in Cully is they're trying to make investments that can keep people there while these economic pressures from the outside are pushing on what's happening there. So I think the other example that I would bring up is also Southwest Quarter, right, where the next rail line is going in. So you see Metro working right now on an equitable housing strategy along with the city of Portland, identifying that naturally affordable housing in the corridor. One of the things that I like to think about is one of the things that happens in that involuntary economic displacement is the folks that are there lose control of assets, right? The history we heard about from Richard has in North and Northeast Portland on the yellow line meant a lot of folks could not buy homes. And so once that economic pressure came in, they didn't control the assets and they were forced to move. So if we look for that in areas where we're bringing large public infrastructure investment, might we be able to prevent it and making sure that it's not an accident and that waiting to happen.
No, so just quickly, a few things. I think that the anticipation point is an incredibly important one. Knowing who's there, anticipating that there might be a pressure, displacement pressure, and putting in place strategies to deal with that. Some of the strategies that have been successful, the long-term public ownership of buildings or nonprofit ownership, affordable buildings that preserve that out of those market pressures. And some of that might be also preservation, acquisition of naturally occurring affordable housing in those areas and keeping that affordable. Other strategies to reduce evictions, to increase home ownership or preserve home ownership. So one of the strategies in Living Color that they're pursuing actually has to do with accessory dwelling units, both providing additional housing in the neighborhood, but also for the homeowners, possibly adding an income stream that helps them to stay in place and to resist some of those pressures. I think other kind of perhaps further out there strategies are things like right of first refusal or right of first offer laws, so that allowing tenants the right to actually buy their units or to pool resources together and buy buildings to preserve them and then funding strategies to help them to do that. So I think that those are some additional strategies I would know.
All right, 2 minutes, so this is the lightning round. Several times throughout the presentation, Richard made reference to opportunity neighborhoods. And some on the panel have also made reference to opportunity neighborhoods. What do you mean by that? What is your definition of opportunity, and how do you organize around it once you found it?
So this is a really challenging question to answer, although there are perhaps some easy answers as well. So I think it's places that have access to things like transit, right? So that you can potentially get access to jobs, things like high-quality schools, access to services, grocery stores, so that you're not within a food desert, things of that nature.
Rich people neighborhoods.
I'll say something different, actually. I think it supports what Dr. Zapata says, that that's what we tend to think of as high opportunity neighborhoods, but neighborhoods where communities are already located may be the neighborhoods they want to stay in, and so forcing them into those high opportunity neighborhoods might not be the highest opportunity for those folks. We got to consider that and be asking them what they want.
I mean, I don't agree with that concept, the concept of opportunity neighborhoods, how I just said it, but that's usually like what they're talking about when they say it on the things, yeah.
All right, we're going to call that a time, so please thank the panel. I would say between our national scholar and expert and this wonderful local panel of experts, you've really kicked this process off wonderfully, and it was, as I said in the beginning, a Thursday night very well spent, and good luck as you move forward on this critical piece of planning.
Thank you. So, just thought I'd clarify. My name is Angel Falconer, and I don't work for the city. I'm a city councilor. No apologies. I want to thank our moderator and our panelists, including Richard, who's not here with us any longer tonight, and also our staff and all of you who took the time to be here tonight. I am overwhelmed by the out. I can't believe how many of you showed up. I'm just so grateful to you. And thanks to the Clackamas County the Community College for letting us use this incredible venue. This is amazing. This really worked out very well, much better than I could have imagined. I'm going to touch back on where we started. According to the 2040 vision our community set out for Milwaukee, ours is a flourishing city that is entirely equitable, delightfully livable, and completely sustainable. It is a safe and welcoming community whose residents enjoy secure and meaningful work, a comprehensive education system, and affordable housing. That's who we say we want to be. It's what you might expect from a progressive suburb of a progressive city in one of the most progressive states in the country. But they are just words. As Councilor Parks mentioned as we kicked off this event tonight, we have an opportunity to make good on that promise as we embark on the work of updating our 30-year-old comprehensive plan. It is my strong desire that the updated plan will require us to take bold action to make that vision a reality. Because without bold action, the vision will remain just words, pretty words, gathering dust on the shelf. Here are some more words. Ugly covenants attached to the 1941 sale of properties in my neighborhood, including where my house now stands. The grantee for himself, his heirs, executors, administrators, and signs hereby covenants that he will use said premises solely for residence purposes, and that he will not construct any dwelling on said premises at a cost of less than $2,000. and that he will not permit said premises to be occupied by anyone except he be a member of the white race. The parties to this contract were clear in their intent to segregate housing by income and race. Eventually, courts rendered such racial restrictions unenforceable, but local jurisdictions adopted other measures that would ensure that our neighborhoods would remain racially and economically segregated, including making it illegal or prohibitively expensive to build many affordable housing options, like smaller homes, duplexes, and multifamily homes, cottage clusters, and ADUs, and requiring large lot sizes, expensive design standards, and difficult and complicated review processes. Indeed, in 1946, 5 years later, the Milwaukee City Council adopted Ordinance Number 481, dividing the city into districts, regulating, restricting, and prohibiting the location of apartment houses and two-family houses, regulating and restricting the area and dimensions of lots and yards, regulating and restricting the height, the alignment of buildings, providing for the establishment of building setback lines, and providing penalties for the violation thereof. Today, 70% of Milwaukee is zoned exclusively for single-family homes, and it remains 84% white. In part because of the restrictions our policies place on building new homes, we are experiencing a significant rise in housing costs, and many longtime residents have been forced out to make room for wealthier households who can afford the higher prices. Tonight, we wanted to promote mutual understanding about the state of housing in our community and to explore some of the barriers and opportunities we face. I believe that understanding our history and recognizing how past and current policies shape the city we have today are critical to charting the more equitable path put forward and truly becoming the community that residents describe in our 2040 vision. The inspiring vision that Milwaukee residents have developed for our city is a big step in the right direction, and we have another opportunity, that obligation you talked about, to continue the path with the comprehensive plan update. We've had a fruitful discussion tonight about some of the tools that we might adapt for our own community to make that reality. You've pointed out some gaps, and I really appreciate that, and we will continue to learn. However, 2 hours is certainly not enough. Significant change will take time, and we cannot do it alone. We are just one part of a larger region struggling with this housing crisis, and local government policy is just one piece of the housing affordability equation. Over the next several months and years, we will need to work with all of you, our community partners, the Housing Authority, nonprofit organizations, and advocacy groups, and private developers. Again, you, our neighbors. We need everyone's help in this effort. I can assure you there will be many opportunities for you to participate in the process of updating our housing policies. City Council, Planning Commission, Design and Landmarks Committees, the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee, all of those meetings are open to the public. Over the next several months, there will be many conversations around housing, both in person and online. We need all perspectives and experiences represented. In addition to providing translation and daycare and other services, please let us know what we're missing. Let us know what else we need to do to make sure that this is an open and accessible process to everyone who wants to participate. Now, I also want to remind you of some of the work that is underway right now. As we mentioned, the comprehensive plan. The city has also partnered with the Clackamas County Housing Authority on its master planning for Hillside Manor and Park. We're hoping to add a lot of new units to that. And my own hope is that it would be mixed income. Code change recommendations for accessory dwelling units. Cottage cluster development will come before the City Council and Planning Commission this summer. We have a new housing website that serves as a one-stop shop for housing resources in Milwaukee. For those of you interested in building housing, staying in your home, or finding a home, the city has put together a list of resources. Visit milwaukeeoregon.gov/housing affordability for more information. The next town hall for the comprehensive plan update will be scheduled for spring 2019. The city's website will stay up to date. Please check it regularly. Please join us. Finally, I want to leave you, all of you, and also my fellow city councilors and County Commissioner Fisher, thank you for joining us tonight. We are extremely grateful for the efforts of our dedicated and talented staff, particularly our Community Development Director, Alma Flores, and Economic Development Coordinator, Valeria Vidal, and many of our staff members who are here tonight as well. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a long day for you all. They put together this exciting panel of local and national experts. We are honored that our panelists have given us your time, shared your knowledge and life's work. Theirs is a large body of work that informs us, inspires us, and challenges us. Let me paraphrase Richard Rothstein from his book, The Color of Law. Racial and economic segregation were not created by accident. Federal, state, and local governments enacted policies that continue to contribute to the housing insecurity we see today. Do we, the public and policymakers, have the political will to take the bold action that is needed to correct it? Thank you.
So do I hit this? I don't know. I think so. I think so.